Happy holidays, everyone. We are in session 3 of our board series, and this session will be focusing on the legal responsibilities of boards. In this particular session, we're going to get into how are boards held to account. When we look at different things like, government agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission, or trying to think of a big one, even the Department of Treasury themselves, who holds, who are they held to account for? They're held to account by other regulatory bodies in the federal government. You have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, and other different branches of the government that looks in and watches what they do. They have subcommittees that they might pull out of the Congress, they have subcommittees that they might pull out of the Senate to make sure that these different government bodies are performing how they should be performing in a given year. So that they're good, they have a standard that they have to meet each and every year, and they have to, report back to these folks that are holding them to a higher level. So that's for government bodies. When it comes to for-profit bodies, they're also responsible to shareholders primarily. And if they're publicly traded, they're held to account to the SEC. They have to be in line with the standards and the rules and the regulations that the Securities and Exchange Commission put out there for them to follow. So those are the different groups that we know of, in our world today that are performing, are behaving, and operating, but they're operating in a way that is at par or above par with standard, because they have these different organizations, individuals, entities that are holding them to account. When it comes to nonprofits, however, that's a little different, because nonprofits don't necessarily have the same types of responsibilities. They don't have the same type of intensity when it comes to performance, bottom lines. Like with for-profits, we're looking for, so much increase in profits. For federal governments, we voted for you so that you can enhance, the quality of our roads, or our libraries. If we don't see that happening, we're not going to vote for you again. So they're held and they're driven by motivation that is pervasive. With nonprofits, it's not necessarily the same way. So what we're going to discuss today is who holds nonprofits to account, what type of entities, what type of individuals, what type of organizations hold nonprofits to account, so that they're performing at a standard at par that would show the fact that they're able to fulfill their mission in a productive way. So the reason why this is important, because you have a lot of conflicting, how can I say this, desires. I'm losing my words right now, but conflicting desires. Like, so a board member may come in and they may have their own agenda. So their agenda might not necessarily be for the uplifting, the improvement, the enhancement of the nonprofit. It might just be for their own success, their own, how can I make myself look better in the public, arena by having affiliation with this nonprofit. So we need things and I guess anchors to hold us to a higher level of accountability, because you have individuals like that on boards, but also not just the boards. You might have, executives, executive directors that I should say CEOs, we'll just say CEOs or executives that are working in the nonprofit, that are responsible to make sure that the operations of the nonprofit are efficient and effective. And for them, they might be, it's whatever, I'm just gonna do my job, get my check, and I'm good. We need to make sure that we have indicators, anchors that hold, the performance, the level of performance of the nonprofit at a whole nother level, so that, we ensure that the mission is performed and that they're operating at optimal levels as efficiently and effectively as they possibly can. So that's what we're going to discuss, today in this session. is, what are those things? What are those elements that do, act and behave in a way that hold us to a higher account as nonprofit and as board members of nonprofits. So with that, I'm going to bring in, my two experts here, Jennifer and Wayne. We're going to chop it up today, discuss these different vicissitudes and layers that present themselves as a benefit to nonprofits. So just to kind of sprinkle some things out there for us to kind of chew on. Nonprofits, they're not left out there, and they're not destitute. There are things and there are individuals, there are systems that hold them to task. And the larger you are as a nonprofit, the more responsible to these different anchors you are, because the more and more of the public see you, and you're just held to a higher account. But at the smaller nonprofits, they can, it's not abnormal for them to, float under the radar because they're so small. But just to sprinkle some things out there for us to kind of chew on, we have the board itself, and then with the board, you want to make sure that you have a board charter, and with that is a plethora of things that fall underneath that umbrella. You have watchdog groups that behave in a way that allows us to anchor ourselves as far as holding ourselves to accountability to those watchdog groups. You have, the Internal Revenue Service. You have state regulatory bodies. I know for the state of Hawaii, we have the Hawaii State Attorney General Office, who's responsible for, keeping track and keeping tabs on nonprofits, their behaviors, their performance, what they're doing. Are they in mission? Are they in standard? Are they, all the applications, all the documents, are they there for this nonprofit? So you have state regulatory bodies that hold us to account. Then you have donors and members also that hold us to account. So you have these different, entities, individuals, organizations that hold nonprofits to account. You also have, like I said, with those bigger nonprofits, media. Media acts, media is pervasive. It acts as a watchdog, I'm going to put quotations around that, for the federal agencies, state agencies, for-profits, as well as nonprofits. And like I said, if you're smaller, you tend to are able to float underneath the radar of that particular anchor, media, but media is one of them. So with that, I believe I'm talking about the first one.
Do you want to get into what that board charter is?
So the board, and I'll say a few things about it, and then we can kind of talk about, wrestle with that a little bit. So with the board charter, we have, you have your I'm not going to get into that, because I know that's your piece. So we have the mission, because I was going to say something, but we have the mission in there. We have the board, I forget, I'm not coming up with this name. It's a manual, so the board manual. And we have meetings, we have minutes for those meetings. And then we have, our roles, our responsibilities as individual board members. We talked about this in a previous session. Treasurer, you have the chair, the vice chair, secretary, and then the other supporting board members that, maybe behave and act on a steering committee, such as the audit committee, the finance committee, different committees. So you have the board and the charter that allows us to hold ourselves internally to a higher standard. But here's the situation with that. You have to be of a mind and a disposition as a group to desire to be held to a higher account. You have to want to perform that way. So yes, it's a good anchor, but it's only as good as the folks around it, And I think one of the things, just to bring you in, Wayne, with our last discussion, one of the things that we dealt with was revisiting missions, revisiting, the board manuals, and revisiting, frequency and how minutes are kept. Because we could have an organization that is performing in a way that's not only inefficient, but it can lean towards, being legally in a state of, danger, if I could say it that way, when it comes to keeping tabs, keeping track on the activity of the organization. So with that, throughout a scenario, that we can kind of chew on, how might a board charter and the performance of that charter be strengthened by the individual members of the board? How might they be able to strengthen that? What do you all think? Not a pop quiz type, but just, what do you think? So what do you think? How might they strengthen the charter themselves? Because you got your mission in there, you got your board manual in there, you got, and they may follow, and when I'm forgetting his name, when boards come together, they follow, Richard would know this, he was totally know this, they follow typically a standard of meeting.
So as far as meetings are concerned, generally they run under Robert's rules.
Robert's rules.
So part of that is to make sure that you have an efficient meeting. Because a lot of times we have such a great passion for the things that we're doing, we tend to get sidetracked. We tend to really get deep into the rabbit hole in a certain area at the expense of other areas that are equally, if not more important, on a regular basis to be discussed. So Robert's rules is a way of making sure that a meeting is done as efficiently and expeditiously as possible. And then, it all starts with having the right agenda, making sure that the items that are going to be covered on that agenda are the ones that are critical to the nonprofit's functioning during the immediate term and possibly during the intermediate and long term as well. You want to make sure that boards are functioning efficiently to plan for the operations of an organization, not just today, but into the future. So many people are trusting us as nonprofits to do those things that are good for society, to do those things that are good for humanity, to do those things which are good for the sake of the planet. So, we look at those kind of things to make sure that the organization is functioning efficiently.
I want to stay on that because, and just from a functionality standpoint, because I know a lot of our viewers, that might be the first time they heard of Robert's rules. From a functionality standpoint, who's responsible for setting up the meetings, when the meetings are going on, for holding time to task, individual to task, and topics to task to make sure that we're covering all of the things that we need to be covering as efficiently as possible? Like what members of the board are responsible and how are they responsible?
Generally, that responsibility falls to the board chair.
Okay.
They're the one that's going to be convening and conducting the meeting. So it's really in the hands of the chair to structure the meeting, right? So there's normally a preliminary agenda that the chair will send out before the meeting. And then in the preliminary agenda, there'll also be a request from any other board member who might want to propose additional items for discussion. Right, and then of course, as you've already mentioned, during the meetings, there's going to be someone reporting, typically the secretary, that records the actions that are going on and the essence of the discussions that are occurring by the board in its furtherance of making sure that the mission is met and that the organization is viable now and in the future. So it falls to the chair.
Okay.
The chair becomes the timekeeper. The chair becomes the person that moves the meeting along and is responsible for making sure that the meeting doesn't get bogged down. Now, sometimes in very large organizations, there is also a role that's played to make sure that Robert's rules are followed, and that's the role of the parliamentarian.
Okay.
And there are very few people who have that specific skill as a parliamentarian. There are some certifications and some training programs on a national basis that actually get into what the particularities of Robert's Rules of Orders are, right? So that people are able to conduct the meeting in a way that is productive and will actually reach a desired result or outcome, or at least have some kind of movement made on particular items that the nonprofit is really engaged in.
That makes sense. And one of the things that we talked about in our last session is the importance of secretaries. So I know the secretary is in here. Let's touch on their role and responsibility in bringing the members together, because they have a heavy responsibility in organizing these meetings and facilitating the documents that might need to be drawn up and looked at by the board and possibly signed by the chair and maybe by each board member themselves to approve. So let's talk about a little bit about the secretary's role in this.
So as far as the secretary or the recorder, they basically document the essence of the conversations or the discussions that are occurring, and they have to specifically document any kind of vote which is taken by the board as to what kind of action follows as a result of the discussions. So, and then the cumulative nature of the minutes basically is something that's very important, because that gets sent out to the board before the meeting so that they can be reviewed, and then at the meeting there can be an approval and acceptance of the minutes. Now this is really critical, because what happens a lot of times from a legal perspective, and I gotta give my disclaimer now, while I am an attorney, I'm not your attorney and you're not my client. So what I'm saying is for information purposes, so that you can become a little more aware of the kind of things that you're responsible for. But the board as a whole has to approve the minutes. So we'll talk about this in other aspects of the board function, but you need to have a quorum of directors or members to accept the minutes. If the minutes are not formally approved and acceptance, then you cannot have the certainty or assurance that the action is being conducted by the organization. Now this is critical, because if the action is not being conducted by the organization, then it's being conducted by individuals in their individual capacity, not as directors or members of a nonprofit. And what this can lead to is individual liability for things which may not work out right. So the board has to, as a body, accept the minutes, because that basically gives the authority to the entire organization that whatever was voted on, whatever was discussed, whatever the direction is the direction of the nonprofit and not the direction of individual directors.
That makes sense. So to my people out there that's watching this, one of the things that you should be taking away from this is the importance of your secretary and your chair to have a bit of know-how or training or understanding of what the responsibilities are there for me as a chair to make sure that we're conducting these meetings as efficient and effectively as possible. We're hitting all of the major topics, we're not leaving anything to chance. And for my secretaries, we want to make sure that we are documenting the conversation, the meeting in such a way that's highlighting these major areas, these major topics, and that we're also, coming up and having the full board to review and ultimately approve those minutes. So that's very important, and it actually is a legal document, though. It's a legal document, so you have to take it seriously. Moving on to, and I'm going to hit on one other thing that because there's other areas in the charter, but I wanted to hit on the meetings and Robert's rules because those are major areas. But I also want to, look at the mission. And I'm going to come over to you on the mission, Jennifer. So the mission of a board. How is that? How can we, as a board, allow that mission to hold us to a higher standard as far as being something that we are held to account by? Is the mission itself? Like, how do you think the mission falls in line there?
Well, I know we've talked about this in a previous session where really the mission is what everyone should be following, especially when it comes to the responsibilities of the board member of the charter. One of the things that we always direct ourselves back to is, are we following our mission or not? Because really, and how you were mentioning revisiting missions and possibly revising them when it comes on the line, because and in a tax perspective, which I'm always stuck in, when it comes to your tax form every year, that 990 file, that very first thing you say is, what is the mission of the organization, right? And I feel that, always keeping that in your mind as a board member, or anything any position when it comes to a nonprofit organization is, okay, this is the mission of our organization. Are we fulfilling it? If not, what do we need to do or change in order to either fulfill the mission as it says, or do I need to revise that mission? And really, like we've touched on this a lot of times, where the mission is just really the main driver, and if anybody is ever straying away, as like we mentioned, individuals going on their own path and deciding to do things, without it being agreed upon, it's like, well, okay, you're following the mission and everything, but is it recorded as such that it's been okay? And one of the things that's been flagging in my head while you were just explaining your pieces is, okay, where's the checks and balances when it comes to, yes, the chairperson is in charge of this, yes, the secretary has to do this, but then, when I hear, okay, the board all has to agree upon it and everything, that's like, okay, so there's a check on that. That's how I know that's working out, everyone's doing what they need to do, and then ultimately they would agree upon it because, yes, it follows the mission. That's just my train of thought.
So it seems like the mission acts as an overarching umbrella that allows everybody to be protected by the elements or whatever they might be under that umbrella. So you have all the board members that are performing, that are meeting, that are discussing. We all should be under a theme, no matter what our topic is, of this mission. So
and you mentioned like an anchor a lot in the beginning. I would think anchor, one of those things would be the mission.
Yeah. So the mission, the theme, and if the board feels that the mission in us conducting our job as board members, meeting, discussing these major topics, if elements of that mission are lost, or we feel this has nothing to do with the mission of the organization, we need to stop and say, hey, let's make sure that we're either in line with the mission, or maybe the mission needs to be revised. Maybe it's outdated. Maybe we need to look at it again. We need to have that mission as our guiding light as we're doing our job as board members. So I agree with that.
Because I know one of the traps I would say that some nonprofits get into is, we need to make money. We need to make money. We need to do funding for this, and somehow it just gets in the back of my head. We're gonna make money so I can have more pay or something like that, right? They're kind of like getting stuck in, I just need to make more money so the nonprofit is more profitable, but it's like, but you're a non-profit. Are you, yes, you're making all this, getting all these donations, making your funding goals, but are you using it for the right things?
No, that makes sense. So I think, we've hit that one pretty hard, and I think that the other and this is the area I was staying away from which is kind of, it's in the board charter, but I wanted to talk about it exclusively. So Wayne, I'm gonna take it back to you with this. Bylaws are one of the major areas that boards can anchor themselves to and to hold themselves to a higher account, because they're not the only ones that might be looking at those bylaws. There are others. So
Sure. Yeah, as far as bylaws are concerned, they're the operating guidelines for the organization, and particularly they are the operational guidelines for the board itself. One of the things to think about as far as nonprofits are concerned is along those lines of legality. There are so many different kinds of laws and regulations that nonprofits have to follow. Much more difficult, probably, to follow all of these rules and regulations than it is for a for-profit organization. Right? Because a for-profit organization is just responsible to the bottom line. Right? You just basically have to make more money for the shareholders. Nonprofit organizations who have a bunch of different rules that come about that have to be followed, of which the bylaws are going to be very critical. But when you think about it, you start with the chartering guidelines, the state law. So in Hawaii, we have the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, which is probably the top layer of regulations that has to be followed, right? Because that's how the organization is created, and that's how the organization is registered, right? And then after that, you have, of course, the IRS, right? You have to follow all of the tax guidelines because you're a nonprofit, and for the privilege of not paying taxes on your revenues and your net income, what you end up having to do is follow all of these different rules that the federal government and the Treasury Department, the IRS, is putting in place. And then you have state operating rules, depending on what kind of organization you have. So like my own background, I worked for a university, and that university is a nonprofit. That nonprofit university exists for educational purposes. So what has to happen is that nonprofit has to comply with accreditation guidelines and different standards that are set out at the state and national level. And then, of course, next thing you'll have is the articles of incorporation themselves, right, which is what documents the organization's creation, the initial board of directors, the initial agent for service and process in case somebody wants to sue that organization for whatever reason. And then you have, of course, in that articles of incorporation, you have the mission, and then after that you have the bylaws, right? And the bylaws are really what governs the operations of the organization, particularly as it relates to the board. And then, of course, after that you have your operating guidelines as to what needs to be done on a day-to-day basis, kind of like job descriptions for people who are actually doing the good work. But as far as the bylaws are concerned, they are important, and unfortunately they become very critical in situations where someone from the outside, whether it's a regulator or an owner or even just a member of the community, chooses to raise an attack against the organization for not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So one of the first things you have to see is the bylaws to make sure that the organization is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and doing it in a way and through the kinds of people that are responsible for that organization's function. So in the bylaws, usually you start out with how many directors you have to have, right? So, and then how do you select these directors? Now we know that according to state law, you have to have a minimum of 3 directors, right? So it's easy to start an organization because you start out with 3 people, and a lot of times it's interesting because those 3 people, one's the chair, one's the vice chair, one could be the secretary treasurer. Would you be able to combine those 2, right? You can't have the same person being the chair and the secretary, but any other combination is permissible. So you got 3, but how many do you want to have, right? Is there a maximum, and are you going to start with this maximum, or are you going to build to it? And then other things in the bylaws, like how often are the meetings going to be conducted? Are they going to be conducted monthly? They need to be conducted at least quarterly, right? And then how are these meetings going to be governed? What are the time frames orders in these meetings? You know, are they on the first Tuesday of the month or the last Wednesday of every third month, whatever it is, it's going to be stated in the bylaws. And then another thing that's critical is that a lot of organizations understand the importance of being able to delegate work and being able to have work done efficiently. So they will create committees. So if committees are created, that needs to be in the bylaws. And then one of the things that you have to do is when you make the bylaws, you want to keep it as simple as possible. Right? Because if you get too involved and you start thinking about all the different things that could happen and all the different committees that could be created to help the organization function better, you might have a situation where you forget to staff one of these committees. Right? And you can get in trouble for that because you have it in your bylaws that you're supposed to have this committee that does this particular function, and that committee never gets constituted. And you have a problem if that occurs. Right? Because again, somebody going after the organization for whatever reason is going to find out, you know, what is the organization actually supposed to look like. And then, of course, you also have to have provisions for what are the director's responsibilities, what are the board members' responsibilities, and if necessary, and I think this is critical, how do you remove a board member?
Yes.
Right? Because there are going to be situations where people are, maybe you get too busy. You know, they at one point in time had great passion for the work of the organization, but because of life getting in the way of so many things, now they don't have the time for it, and they haven't bothered to communicate that to the organization. So there needs to be a methodology for the removal of directors if necessary. Right? So like particular standards as far as attendance is concerned. Right? If you miss X number of board meetings in a row, you can't be removed automatically because that indicates someone disassociating with the organization, right? And giving them perhaps an automatic or more graceful way of exiting rather than having to confront the individual and say, hey, you know, you still with us or what? Right? So there, you know, you need to have methodology or methods there to remove board members, right? And then one of the things that we've seen probably in almost every nonprofit in the state of Hawaii, at least, right, is how are the board meetings going to be conducted? Right. So, are you going to be in a situation where I think a lot of organizations were up until 2020 that board meetings always occurred on a face-to-face basis, right? And in the bylaws it says that the board shall meet on the first Tuesday of each month. In, you know, and then basically that presumes that that's going to be an in-person meeting. Now, of course, what happened with the COVID regulations and people being locked down and shut into their homes, a lot of these meetings went to virtual situations, right? Now, while that's totally understandable, that has to be something that's authorized in the bylaws, right? So bylaws may have to be amended to include this because, you know, it's just have to be done, right? And a lot of times things change because the law says you have to change, right? In the situation of COVID, we all have to stay home, and we couldn't meet outside, you know, especially in larger groups like a board might be. So there was the need to do things electronically. Now, along with those lines, along the lines of meeting electronically, one of the things that boards have to understand is that if they are to do an electronic meeting, you know, or some kind of video conferencing app or software, it really needs to be one in which all board members can still meaningfully participate. Which means it's not going to be a telephone call on a speakerphone where you're not sure who's there or what they're doing or if they, you know, if they're listening or if they want to say something. So if you're doing like a lot of us did Zoom meetings, right? Zoom has a functionality where every person on the Zoom call can actually speak. And we know that they can actually, you know, hear what is going because there's audio as well as video. Right? And those are the kind of situations that we want to make sure that we have in place so that we know in the event that there is any kind of question as to what goes on, we we know that the board members who were present, you could see their little boxes with their faces in it, and you could see that the microphone was able to be turned off and on, and there was ample opportunity for discussion, and that might did go on, right? And you might want to have gone so far as to record some of those Zoom sessions, right? So that you have that as a record that all of the directors or quorum of the directors was present, and that each and every one of them had the opportunity to meaningfully participate in discussion, and weren't just a black box on the screen that really was not certain whether somebody was there or not. So we have all of these kind of things in the bylaws, and they basically talk about when are directors going to be elected. Are there going to be staggered terms for directors? How many directors are there going to be? What are the processes in the event that a director has to be removed? Right? And then also in the bylaws, you need to have something that says, hey, bylaws can be amended. Here's the process for amending the bylaws, right? So that you would be able to make sure that you're complying with whatever it is that the organization's leadership, the board, is responsible for doing.
I want to stress that point. You mentioned several really good potent points, and I want to create a scenario that happens quite often. I'm a nonprofit. I'm performing the mission, being led by the board, performing the mission, the strategic plan. We're going forward. There comes an opportunity in, let's say, an election. There's some funds that are designated to fulfill some type of mission around the country, and they know if you are doing something related to this mission, we have these federal funds available to you. Let's say it's a significant amount of federal funds, and we find ourselves as a nonprofit utilizing probably 25% of our sources coming from, in the future, those federal funds, which puts us into a compliance type situation that we weren't in before because we're receiving federal funds. So there's that issue, there's that piece there. Right now, we have a committee for the audit, we have a committee for the state, we have all these different committees, but this compliance is new. It's just new president, new people. We want to fulfill this goal in our country, so these funds are available to us. So we just started to use these. So we have that issue there, but there's another issue I want to bring up as well to see where this falls. Because we talked about this in the last session. We had a scenario where we had an executive director performing their role, their duties, but they were starting to perform at an ineffective, inefficient level. But we signed a contract with them. The board, as a group, hired them. At the end of the year, we did a review, and we were able to let them go. Richard brought up a good point. There needs to be some type of frequency and standards by which we're measuring these executive directors so that we're able to quite swiftly look at, see if they're performing how we need them to perform as an ED, and if not, we have to, seek out a new ED. The stretch I want to push on you, Wayne, and Jennifer, is how might, one, do we need to look at amending our bylaws? And two, if so, how might we approach that to address these two situations, the compliance situation as well as the ED review situation?
Well, I think from an employment perspective, if you want to thank you with it.
The ED.
Okay. Well, sorry, I was stuck on the compliance portion because I was thinking, do I need a committee?
Or do you need a committee?
And that's the question.
So do you need a committee? And do you have the flexibility in your bylaws to constitute a new committee? I know that you have previously mentioned the fiduciary responsibilities of a director or a board member, right? And we understand that, the big three, the duty of loyalty, the duty of care, and the duty of obedience. So when you take a look at the duty of care, clearly it says that you have to do your job and you have to know what you're doing. Now, you're bringing up a situation where it is that you don't know what you're doing yet, right? Because this is a new area that you're getting into. So, I go back to the basics. The first thing I would ask is this part of the mission? Or is this mission creep just to get more money? There's a lot of organizations that fall into that kind of situation, right? And they're so far afield of what their mission is that they really shouldn't be there. And there's no reason for them to be there other than the financial reason of getting the government grant or the donation. And that's a bad place to be because you're in an area where you have no skill or expertise and you're basically out on a limb just waiting for it to break and you would fall off and for your organization to crash and burn. Right? But let's say it's not a mission creep, it's within the context of the mission. Right? We know that the duty of care says that you can consult and you can retain professionals in a particular area and you can rely on their judgment and expertise as a board member as doing your fiduciary duty. Right? So if you're in that area where you got a brand new area that you have to deal with, one of the things that you may want to do to do this in-house kind of speaking is to find a new board member that has expertise in that area. Right? Like a lot of times, one of the things that we do is we want money, is we go out and we get board members who know how to raise money. Right? The people who started the organization may not have had that skill set. They got the passion, they got the love, they got the desire to do good, but they don't know how to go and ask somebody for money. Right? So you got to bring some people in that have the ability to do that, and that's part of their responsibility of being on the board. Right? And that's something that's critical. And as much as I don't necessarily want to focus on that too much, because the board's responsibility is fiduciary. It's not fundraising. There is a problem that you get into if you fail your fiduciary duty. There is no law that says that it's failure to fundraise is actionable legally. There is no such law. Right? Your law, your duties are fiduciary. They are legal duties. They are not fundraising duties. Right? So failure to fundraise is not a violation of law. But in the event that you find yourself in these situations where you get these new programs, then you have to develop or hire expertise in this area. So if you have some big federal grant or contract that you need to follow, now you have to follow federal rules or guidelines of contracting, which one of those levels of law or administrative responsibility that nonprofits have to follow, and there's so many of them, right? But that level at the following whatever is necessary at the state or national level to be in compliance with whatever it is that you're doing as an organization. And as long as it's within that mission, you can create a committee, right? If you have it within your bylaws to be able to create things, and it should be something that should be flexible. I think when you looked at your articles of incorporation, it's very common in the organizational section. Here's the mission, and then after the mission, typically it says what you're going to do, and then it has kind of like a catch-all and other endeavors that are legally permissible, which allows you to expand a little bit of what you do. Right? Very common in the for-profit section to see that, because as society changes, as technology changes, as the market changes, you have to be able to accommodate those changes to be viable, to be profitable. Nonprofits also have to be able to accommodate these kind of changes so that they can continue to do the good work that the mission sets out. Right? So you can rely on expertise in those areas. Now, of course, that means that to some extent you will either have to get a board committee going that has some expertise and some skill in that area, and then you probably, if you were thinking about this, and you should be thinking about this, in writing up the board bootcamp, you should include a section on how to get expertise in this area. And then you should also include a section on how to get responds to the request for proposal. Hopefully you put in a line item that allows for someone that has expertise in management
Yeah.
of the grant or the
Yeah.
contract that you have, right? So
Yeah.
that you know, basically, you wouldn't start a new endeavor, let's say like to create a homeless shelter,
Yeah.
so that you're housing people who cannot find shelter on their own. In that endeavor, you would clearly put a project manager into
Yeah,
that, right? That would be the director of that
Yeah.
project, because your primary mission or your primary functions of the organization up until this time may have been just feeding people, right? So you have people that have skills as far as managing the kitchen and being able to do things within health and safety guidelines that relate to the provision of food to people. Now you're going to provide housing to them, and it's not necessarily the same kind of skill set that you already have within your staff or on your board. So now you have to go out and get people, and hopefully build this into the process so that it is something that you can easily accommodate. Right? You have the resources to reach out to get someone that you can pay to do these
That's
things
right.
that have expertise there. And then hopefully you're also able to look at your board, and if you don't have people with this kind of skill set, to tap into people who are a little bit more aware of the need as far as housing for those who are unshelterless and so on. So I think that's the kind of thing that you would look at as far as looking at these kinds of things like federal contracts,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
where you don't have the skill or expertise
Yeah.
currently. You need to, like any organization or any business, go out and get that skill.
Yeah.
Or you need to have someone develop that skill
Yeah.
in-house.
Yeah. I think that's actually a really good point, and I'm glad you touched on federal funds, state funds potentially may take you away from the mission that you're supposed to be on, and the ability to utilize professionals. So you may want, and those of you out there, you may actually want and are seeking out federal funds. I think it probably is wise to go and find a legitimate, possibly grant writer, someone who actually understands that industry and understands how to look at your situation, what your mission is, and find the appropriate funds for you, instead of you as a lay woman, a lay man going out there and saying, oh, this looks like money that we can kind of align ourselves to and kind of get, and it's similar to what we do. It might not have nothing to do with your mission. And you might very well be able to go out and grab those easy funds, but again, you're gonna be on a slippery slope, so you have to be careful about that. And I think it's wise, again, if you're not, you don't have that ability as a grant writer to identify and match up nonprofits with funding sources when it comes to federal and state funds, you shouldn't be in that realm. That's not your highway that you need to be on. You need to find an expert to get you on that highway. So I think with those elements, it's critical that you all, you take pain and you take, the appropriate steps to make sure that you have those levels of expertise. When it comes to understanding the different programs, if they do fall within your mission that you get yourself involved in, when it comes to you as a nonprofit, you as a board, it is important. Like if the funds are there, and you might possibly be able to use them for viable programs, but you may not know the intimate detail of how that particular program should be run, how you should facilitate it. You need to go out and get some expertise in that, so that again you don't find yourself on a slippery slope.
And just to circle back, because I know you had a two-part to that question.
Yeah.
The second part was, what if you don't have a director that doesn't fit, right? And as I've said in a previous podcast, throw them off the ship in the nicest way possible with a lifeboat. But really, as Wayne had touched on it, it is in the bylaws as far as the procedure you would follow. And so as long as you're following that procedure, I don't think it's terrible to just say, okay, you know what, we did our communication, we did our due diligence, and it's just not working out. This is the process, and sorry.
So but I think, so from our last, and just because we kind of got into this the last time, so the director we're talking about is we'll say the CEO. That's the person that's at the organizational level that the board hires to do the job of operating the organization. So I'm gonna say CEO just so we can kind of delineate between board of director and the person that is in a position to run the organization. So with our last scenario, the board, or not the board, but the ED was just not performing at par. And because of the contract that we've allowed them to sign and the board hired them, and they were working and operating within their duties, but they were just inefficient and they weren't effective. So they actually had that annual contract that as long as they're doing the basics of their job, and if we don't have any requirements that, hey, you got a quarterly review, that we're gonna look at this, this, and this, we really don't have a leg to stand on as a board, because they can take us to court. Like, we signed the contract, as I'm the CEO and I signed it, you the board hired me to do this job. This is my job description, I'm doing it. Right. So, and so to me, I think that once the board goes through a process a year like that, we gotta keep them, we can't. But once they're at the end saying, okay, we can let them go now, but now we have to be very careful and cognizant that we need a better process, because we can't have this type of thing happen again, because we just lost these funds from this donor, this grant source, because they were just mismanaging things, but they were functioning within the framework of the job, specifications.
So you're telling me they're doing the bare minimum that they're required to do, so there's no real reason, or no good reason to have to let them go.
And we have no specifications.
Even though it's a majority vote on the other end?
See, if it's not in the regulations, they can hold us to task for that. Like if you fire me and I'm doing the basics of what's in that job description, and there was nothing about a quarterly review or semi-annual review, there's nothing like that. There's no standards that you're setting for me to meet beyond that job description. Like, okay, go ahead. And then my attorney will be calling, will be reaching out to your attorneys, whatnot. So I think that would bring me back to potentially revisiting, if that's where it needs to be, revisiting that section of the bylaws and understanding, is there a different method that we need to employ? And it's not necessarily for the board to get their hands in the detail of operations. That's not the purpose. The board is responsible for making sure that the nonprofit is healthy, it's efficient, it's operating at optimal levels, and their role in that is hiring leadership that has the disposition to fulfill that target. And if the leadership that they've hired is not fulfilling that disposition, the board cannot supersede them and know, okay, so you're not running payroll right, they can't do that. They need to have a way to say, okay, you know what, you're not doing what needs to be done.
Can I put an amendment in?
Well, I think that's what you're looking at, but at the same time, you don't, like Aaron said, you don't want the board to be micromanaged anyway. So you have to have processes and procedures in place for periodic evaluation to see whether or not somebody's doing their job. And I think this will go back to an issue of the bylaws. One of the other things that the bylaws really should be very clear about is indemnification of directors in the event of a lawsuit against the organization. That the directors will be indemnified by the organization and held harmless for any kind of legal consequences that may go on, particularly in these kind of areas. Now, no one goes quietly into that dark night anymore, right? If you throw somebody overboard, they're going to yell and scream, right? Even if they're in a lifeboat, or especially if they're in a lifeboat, because then they'll go take that lifeboat directly to the nearest sympathetic ear, which could be the media,
Yeah.
which we probably will discuss in a little bit.
Yeah.
But you also need to look at, in the process of creating the board and staffing the board, you also have to inform the board, and you have to protect the board, right? So in the bylaws, you have those clauses for indemnification. And then further, I think most people that are asked to be on boards of any significant size organization are going to ask, do you have D&O insurance, directors and officers?
That's right.
An additional layer of protection in the event that something goes wrong that the organization cannot protect you. Then there's insurance as a means of risk management for the directors to be able to fall back
That's
on.
right.
And I think now even more so what's become prevalent is that organizations that have employees, and the executive director is typically the sole employee of the board, right? The board hires the executive director, and the board is responsible for that executive director. So the board would also have the ability to terminate that executive director. Now, of course, even if it's termination for cause, people do not go without filing any kind of lawsuit, right? So there is an additional kind of insurance that's necessary when you have employees, because there are so many actions which are being premised on discrimination claims like Title VII, and sexual harassment claims like Title IX, and disability claims, like Americans with Disabilities, and age discrimination. So there's a whole slew of things out there that people can say, hey, you're saying it's for cause, but really it's because I'm this age, or I'm this, I have this disability, or I'm this ethnicity, or I'm this sex. And there is a kind of insurance out there now that's becoming more prevalent, which is employment practices liability insurance. This is another layer of protection that you want to be able to offer your board, especially if you have employees, because of course you then will have to deal with all of the labor issues, right, as another layer of responsibility.
Right.
Because nonprofits that have employees are treated the same way as for-profits that have employees, right? And we know that there are a lot of problems that have come about, and a lot of lawsuits that are filed, and maybe a lot of these are not really legitimate lawsuits, but they're lawsuits nonetheless, and you have to respond to them, and you don't want to have your board responding to too many of these, because then they're not going to be able to do their governance responsibilities for the organization. And then, if I were asked to be on board this time, I'm asking about all of these things, because I don't want to be subject to having to go to the court for the good work that I wanted to do helping the community. And it's something that you don't want to think about, but you have to think about.
Absolutely. I think what we're going to do is we're going to fast track to the Internal Revenue Service and media. I want to hit those two before we end. So we're going to fast track to the Internal Revenue Service and then media. There's two more, but we'll catch them up in the next mini section of this mini series of this section. But I'll hit on the Internal Revenue Service real quick, and then we'll jump into media. Because media, I think, is kind of fun. I think it's pretty fun. Like, you get into media, you kind of like, oh, they're doing what with the money, because it's kind of fun there. I mean, it's not good fun, but it's kind of like it kind of will kind of let you like, wow, yeah, you do all these things, and there are folks watching you, and when it comes to light, the destruction of a nonprofit is not necessarily anything that the nonprofit itself did, or is doing inefficiently. It's just that the media has put you on a pedestal that is not, or disdained by the public, and that's it. That's your life. You're done. But the Internal Revenue Service, that's one that we discussed, and this is what I want to hit it real quick, because we have gone over the Internal Revenue Service quite a bit. But in the sense of holding the organization to account, the Internal Revenue Service has a subsection or subgroup within the body of the Department of Treasury that just focuses on nonprofits. They ensure and review and make sure, I shouldn't say make sure, but they try to ensure that these organizations that have been given the right to file tax-free are operating in a way that's serving some approved mission, and that every year they're reporting that activity up to them, and that the information that they're reporting is in line with the approved mission that they were given by the IRS. The IRS has a number of tools that they can utilize to damage the nonprofit to the standpoint of destroying it. They can revoke. If you want to be dismissed, you just missed 3 periods of tax submissions, and they will give you a nice, pretty revocation letter saying that you are no longer recognized as a nonprofit. And that it permeates throughout the federal government and into the states. So once they say no, that's it. You know, you have to take the steps to try to reinstitute yourself as a nonprofit. So they have that level. They also have a level that we don't necessarily talk about a lot, but they have fines and penalties. You know, they can fine you. And I know it's not about, because you might think, well, we're not making money, so you know, maybe I can file and I won't get fined, I won't get penalties because, you know, I'm not making any money. It's not true. Miss a tax return or put in a tax return late, and it's an automatic fee. I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago that fee was like $800. I'm not sure what it is right now, but it's an automatic penalty. Just a day, 2 days late, it's a penalty. So they have that tool to ensure that you're doing what you need to do. And they also have a tool of audit. If they look at your financials 990 and they say, you know, something looks funny, something looks really, really, really funky here, pull them up for review. We're going to pull them, and it's just like any normal IRS shaking your boots audit. It's an audit, you know, and the IRS will comb through the activity more so than a for-profit, just to make, because you are, as a nonprofit, have been given a gift basically of not having to pay taxes. So they're going to make sure that if they look at your statement and it looks like something's going on that's fishy, you better be sure that all of your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed when they come through in the audit. So those are the tools that IRS has to review and hold the nonprofits to account. So with that, we're going to jump into media. I'm going to refer to you, Jennifer, for media. So how does media hold nonprofit? I can think of a bunch of examples, you know, but I want you, you know, just to talk about it and chew on it a little bit. It doesn't have to be actual. There's actual examples out there of how nonprofits have been destroyed, you know, due to media publicity. But why is that such an important element or entity in the standards that hold nonprofits to account? Why do you think it's so important?
Well, for one thing, whatever the media puts out there, it'll get to the masses like that, you know. And with how the environment of the media is nowadays, it's not just newspaper news now, it's social media, that's right. Whatever gets posted online. That's right. And I know a lot of us fall to things called clickbait, and you read a headline and you're like, wait, really? That's what they did? Yeah. And you won't even read the article. You'll just read the headline and then go about your way. Yeah. You know, just like even on like the radio when you're driving out, they'll tell you one line, you'll take it with you and run with it, you know? Yeah. And I think that's a lot of the problems when it comes to media nowadays, is a lot of us don't do our due diligence, go online and read, did they do this or not? Or am I just following that headline, you know? And with that said, like you were saying, it puts organizations on this pedestal, like this is the headline that the media said about this organization, whether it's something good or something bad. But I think because of the climate of how media is nowadays, whatever is put out there now, it's get rid of it,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So with that said, I think, you know, organizations are kind of like, you know, more or less, I guess, what is the word? Not protective, but, you know, cautious, I would say.
Okay. I want to speak to this because I'm not going to tell you what this guy was filming, but something was happening a few weeks ago, and I was in my car, and I saw like this situation going on. It was a situation between two people that were engaged, and they looked like they were going to fight. Everybody had their phone out. And I was like, is anybody going to just come up and just, hey, you know, what do you guys, but everybody had their phone out and they were capturing this, and they were just, you know, and some were not trying to be very, like, you know, just kind of like film, but everybody was filming it. So that's how social media behaves today. Like, it's so
Everyone's
intrusive.
a news outlet.
It's so intrusive, and we have a standard, and Wayne actually knows, and actually Jennifer knows this too. There's a standard under the code, the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct, and it says that you must be independent in fact and appearance. I think it's important for all nonprofits, all of you looking, that in these days, in the past, it's just in fact. Are you in fact, you know, performing in a way that you should be performing as a nonprofit? You're representing that nonprofit in such a way that you're supposed to be. Are you doing that in fact? And that was fine. But in these days, it has to be, you have to be performing in a way that is in fact the right way that you should be performing. But you also have to appear the appropriate, you know, it has to be appearance as well. And what I mean by that is, if you have a situation where you're a nonprofit and you should not be affiliated with something else or some organization, if you're a board member, if you're a face of that nonprofit in any way, form, or fashion, you might not want to be at that organization. Even if that is permissible, you can go and you can shop there, you can buy there, you can communicate, you can eat dinner, whatever. If that's something that's against the mission of how other people see your nonprofit performing, listen, that might be something that you can't do until you're off that board or no longer affiliated with that nonprofit. Because all it takes is one meme, and when you got TikTok, and all it just is a virus, and it's probably one of the fastest ways to shut down a nonprofit. So, and that's the world we live in. I don't know if you all have anything to add about that.
So how would you mitigate that if it happens? So for example, Photoshop exists.
Okay.
And say you get someone takes a picture of you, they edit it, whatever, and it makes you look bad as a board member of this organization.
Okay.
Are you gonna kind of?
I wish I could bring, so my director, she's hiding behind the camera. I'm going to say it now, but I wish I could bring my marketing and branding manager out, because that's public relations. I mean, and Wayne, you can kind of, you know, help me on this. The public relations is the one that douses that particular flyer, and that probably is a role that is becoming more and more important. Not only having an individual on the board with that skill set, but also maybe having an individual within the organization that's hired by the ED that has that skill set of public relations. But I think public relations is becoming so important, and not just old school public relations. Do you know social media? Do you know how to do the Instagram thing and the TikTok thing and all this other kind of jazz? And I'm saying all of that, folks, like that because I have a flip phone, so I don't know that kind of thing. But you need that person to be able to douse that flyer. So
I very much agree. And one of the things that I think we have to pay attention to is kind of the age composition of our boards. Because what we find is that still, I think the great majority of people who serve on boards are probably baby boomers. Right, that are just not adept at these kinds of social media kind of issues and platforms. We grew up at a time where we took Civics 101, and it said that we had three branches of government, right? The legislative, the executive, and the judicial. One made the law, one enforced the law, one interpreted the law. But then along came this idea that there was a fourth estate that was above all three of the branches of government, which was in fact the media. That they were judge, jury, and execution, right? And they could make or break. But in those days, I think even for us baby boomers, we understand those kinds of ideas. But these were edited media, right? They were big media outlets that had editorial responsibilities, editorial practices. Now we've come to like a fifth branch or a fifth estate, which is social media, which is self-published, and it is very difficult to get around what happens out there because you just can't control it, and no one's controlling it, right? So I think like as Aaron said, as you said, like you need somebody responsible for making sure that the good work that's out there. So I think as organizations and as board members in a lot of organizations that don't have a lot of staff, we have to be very mindful of trying to capture the good work that we do. Getting the testimonials, making sure we have the proof statements as to what we actually are accomplishing. That there are people in the community that will attest to the good work that we did, not just us going out there and saying that we're doing all of these things and proclaiming what our mission is, but actually having people who have been touched by the work of our organizations that are willing to go out there and say, hey, this group of people, this body, this nonprofit, is responsible for me still being on the planet today, right? And living a much better life. And I think, like they say, sometimes the best revenge is a life well lived. So if you can show how well your organization is functioning in the current climate, I think that goes a long way to being able to refute any kind of negative press that comes about. And at the same time, I think this is something that, when you said about examples of how the media can make or break organizations, sometimes you just have to be aware of the fact that can happen, right? And what are your contingencies? How do you do damage control? How do you get the good work back out there to be the thing that's on the person's mind rather than the bad thing that just happened? And I think part of it is understanding what your responsibilities are as a board and as an organization. The example that I always go back to is there is a very large nonprofit out there that does things for disabled veterans, and they have a real bad run of things when their executive director and the president and some of the higher ups were found to have been spending money lavishly on themselves, right, and writing it off against the nonprofits' profits or net income or revenues. One of the interesting things about this particular organization is they've come back, and I think they're doing well once again, doing their charitable work. But I think one of the things that's interesting about that particular organization, and something that you probably touched on and maybe touched upon because you've been addressing the issue of funding so much, is how much overhead can you devote to building your brand?
That's right.
And up until now, and still, I think a lot of organizations are evaluated on how much their overhead is or really isn't. How low can you keep your overhead? But at the same time, we all know the stories. You have these little fundraisers where everybody goes out and bakes a cake and you sell them, and you have no overhead, and you have all the profit going to the organization, but you make $500. But you have zero overhead, so that's okay, right? But you only got $500. Now, this organization that serves disabled veterans, their net, their gross revenues are probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and their overhead is in the hundreds of millions of dollars as well. But what's left over at the end of the day is several more hundreds of millions of dollars, right, that got created because of the use of media, right? And that allows for a much greater provision of services, than the $500 bake sale that had no overhead.
That's right. That's right.
So organizations have to be mindful of those kinds of things, but they also have to be mindful of the role that the media may play in bringing to light how much is being spent on overhead, and you got to be able to justify it.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
I mean, if you're spending it to make the organization more functional and have more revenue, then that's great. I think you get away with that, right?
Yeah.
You can refute any kind of negative media that comes about as a result of it. But if you're using, first class airfare or private jets, like this one organization's executives are doing, you're going to get crucified, and rightfully so.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we actually hit on, this was a rich conversation, and I'm sure you all will have some follow-up questions for us. So please make sure you send those in to us, and we will address those in the next session. So just to recap, and then we'll close this particular part of this first part of this session out. Important things that you as board members and as executives and as staff of nonprofits need to consider, if you haven't considered it before. Making sure that you have some sort of standard when it comes to the board themselves meeting and discussing different important topics about the board. Making sure that the performance is understood. The performance of you as a board, as a nonprofit, is held to several anchors. You have your anchor of the mission, you have your anchor of the charter, you have your anchor of the bylaws, you have your anchor of the media, you have your anchor of the IRS. All these things are critical and important, and you need to be aware of them and understand that you do have to perform at a certain level, because there are other entities out there that are watching you and that are trying to determine if you're doing the things that you have been approved and blessed to be able to do for the community. Because if you're not doing that, then any one of those anchors can pull you down. So you have to be cognizant and careful about that. We will jump into another whole area talking about legal responsibility of boards in our next part of this session. But thank you, and again, we look forward to getting your questions so we can address those in the next session.